Ja, det var inte hans plan, men efter 15 år i rekryteringsbranschen så kände Hung Lee att han började tappa inspirationen på jobbet. Han började då istället producera ett nyhetsbrev med intressant läsning och poddar avsett för sina branschkollegor att ta del av. Idag når han varje vecka ut till tiotusentals läsare och lyssnare med det allra senaste inom HR och rekrytering. Och hans nyhetsbrev har vuxit till att bli ett världsledande community för rekryterare och HR-personer världen över. Han föreläser över hela världen och modererar ofta debatter. Och idag så har han gjort ett nedslag i hur pandemin har påverkat företags rekryterings-, mångfalds- och inkluderingsarbete internationellt. We have him with us today, directly from London. Welcome to Unbiased Day, Hung Lee.
Wow. Hello, everybody. Good morning. And thank you for sharing some time with me today. I'm truly honored to be part of this amazing event. I don't speak Swedish, so I need to apologize in the first instance for conducting this talk in English. I know all of you are amazing with the language, but I do appreciate the additional effort it takes to pay attention to someone in their second language. So I appreciate this greatly. The topic of the talk is reshuffling the deck, a DE&I in the remote first world. I think all of us have been part of this amazing experiment, haven't we? 2 years we've had this now. We've all kind of had this really seismic shift away from working in an office and into a remote setting. And I think one of the things that the shift to remote has done for us when it comes to DE&I is that it's really put into sharp relief the people who are always being excluded from the on-premise in-office environment. We never saw those folks because we never actually recruited them. We never even understood what these challenges would be. And there's no question that the shift to remote has had a tremendous increase in accessibility to underprivileged populations. Having said that, we also understand, and this is starting to emerge for us as we get a little bit more familiar with working in this way, is that there are additional and new challenges, emerging challenges for diversity, inclusion, and belonging that come specifically from working in a remote first world. So this topic is going to be, this talk is going to be split into 3 parts. Firstly, let's look at the newly included, the people that are included in the world of work now that we've shifted to a remote first. We will then examine who are the newly excluded, the people who are challenged with a shift to remote. And finally, we'll move to examine, what we can do about it. I think all of us have now a heightened awareness of the importance of these topics. So it isn't beyond us to try and put together some solutions to it. So if we're ready, we can get on with it. Firstly, I call these the remote first is the newly included. Who are the people who have been included by the shift to remote? It turns out there's many different types of populations that were always underserved by having to commute to the office. The office environment is optimized for a certain type of person, optimized for a certain type of lifestyle, and it's no surprise that those types of people had always had the advantage and typically were the ones that thrived in success in their careers. Good example would be this, the differently abled. Probably the most obvious advantage of moving to a remote first environment is that suddenly people who have mobility issues are no longer as challenged as they were in the first instance. Some of this data is picked out from the United States, and it turns out that as many as 67 million adults in the United States live with a disability. 13% of those are mobility issues. So you imagine how many hundreds of thousands and millions of people who we as recruiters never actually ever saw in our recruiting pipelines because they were never able to physically make it to work. With the shift to remote, you would hope that some of those people can now participate in the work environment. What about primary caregiving? Even in a country like Sweden, which is often held as the exemplar of gender equality, particularly when it comes to parenting, but we all know that the rule of thumb is still the case that the woman is the primary caregiver for children and the elderly. And the elderly. Now, have a think about what this means when you're in an on-premise environment and you're looking at people to come in and do interviews and physically be in person. The primary caregiver has additional responsibilities to think about, logistical problems. Who is going to take care of the child? Who is going to take care of the parent? Can I take some time off? All of those things that a person that isn't a primary caregiver doesn't have to worry about. So there's no reason. This is one of the main reasons why we see a different applicant rate for certain jobs based on gender, because of the primary caregiving divergence in responsibility. With remote work, I'm not saying primary caregiving changes in any way, but it does mean that the logistical challenges of going to interview have changed. They've been alleviated because we can do it from remote. Just got to reconnect my app here. Here we go. I think this should work. Give me one sec, folks. Here we go. Okay, what about the urban poor? Commuting is actually expensive. Again, you look at different countries based on their public transport and transportation issues. Some countries are really not well provisioned to supply people in terms of moving from home to the office. The distance between where you live and where you work is a huge factor in terms of whether that person is a viable candidate or not, and whether the job is a viable opportunity or not. If you can't afford a car, for instance, and you need to drive a certain distance to go to the job, generally speaking, you're no longer going to consider that opportunity. Again, with the shift to remote, the costs come down. You're able to participate without having to invest in this type of asset. What about in-work assets, in-work candidates? This is a hidden sort of disadvantage. People who are in work, obviously, if you're on premise, it's very difficult to start a recruiting process. You're sitting next to your boss. What are you going to do? You have to typically take time off on holiday in order to pursue other work opportunities. That means that the allocation you get annually per country and per company makes a huge difference in your ability to actually investigate job opportunities. Of course, I think, again, Sweden is very highly ranked in terms of holiday allocation, but regardless of the case, it is still the scenario where an in-work candidate in an office is going to be tremendously disadvantaged compared to a remote working candidate who can suddenly be away from the proximity of the boss. What about the neurodiverse? Again, one of the hidden disadvantages of working in an office. It turns out that extroverts may have always had this hidden advantage. They were always better able to handle things like interviews, be involved in team meetings, get involved in all of the social work, the social effort required to, build profile and to build professional profile in business. The introverts always had this issue. With remote work, is this alleviated? Probably by some great degree. How about ethnic minorities? This one surprised me a little bit. It turns out that actually a lot of people who are visible ethnic minorities essentially feel more accepted in a remote-only environment than they do on-premise. So what has actually been going on in the on-premise environment? What is happening in the office prior to our shift to remote? Probably some microaggressions or probably some exclusionary conversations. I would imagine most of them probably unwitting, but they would still cause a situation where the individual worker might feel as if they don't belong. It seems that working in a remote environment, some of these issues are alleviated. But remote first isn't the panacea that we think it is. It turns out, having done this experiment for now 2 years, there are new challenges emerging for a remote first world that also create a different type of exclusion. Let's examine what these are. How about the home environment? It turns out when we talk about working remote, nearly 80% of us working from remote is actually working from home. Now, if you have a safe home environment, that makes it a very suitable place to conduct your business. However, unfortunately, a percentage of us do not have a safe home environment. Perhaps you have an issue with your partner. Perhaps you're living in a situation where there's danger in your home environment. Suddenly your ability to perform as a worker is hugely compromised. This is a new diversity issue that we haven't even thought about. What is the home environment like for the worker that is remote? How about a non-control work environment? This data is actually from Sweden. What is the household composition? Turns out remote working, the optimal way in which you configure your household is a single person without children, probably without a pet, living at home in their own sort of environment. You have a controlled work environment. You can set your space and you can make sure that the interrupts are a minimum. You compare that to a young college graduate, let's say, who might be house sharing with 3 or 4 other people. And what do you have? You basically have a really poor version of a WeWork, a noisy, uncontrolled environment, very difficult to do deep work, very difficult to focus, probably very difficult to perform well when you're going to a job application process. Poverty doesn't actually change in terms of the compromise it does to the candidate. You might swap out the cost of commute, but suddenly you need to think about technology. Do you have the right Wi-Fi? Do you have enough bandwidth? What is the camera quality like? What is the sound quality like? All of those things have an impact on how that candidate might appear in the recruiting process. How about ageism? This was also the case pre-COVID, where we had this kind of feeling that if you're above a certain age, maybe you're going to be too old for this new world we're trying to build. This is data pre-COVID, by the way, 2017. It was already on trend before we moved to remote. Moving to remote, of course, is an increase of digitization. So has ageism actually increased as a result of our shift here? And there's also ageism in the other direction. Are people too young? Are there individuals that we don't trust enough to work in a distributed way, away from guidance and away from physical mentorship? It turns out that that may also be a new diversity issue that we need to think about. And gender, of course, comes back again as it always does. It turns out that men and women behave differently when it comes down to video. Some really interesting data suggests that women actually turn out to switch off video by default more often than men do, probably because of the greater scrutiny that women have to face when it comes down to their physical appearance. Now, this is really interesting and quite important because how much of the information that we share is actually non-verbal? How much are you getting from my physical sort of micro expressions right here? All of these things, it might mean that we are judging people differently based on how often they appear on video compared to audio. And again, neurodiversity. We all know people who have really struggled with the shift to remote. These are the extroverted types that perhaps really do need to be proximate with other people and physically with other people in order to operate and feel happy. Have we just swapped one disadvantage for another? Are we now penalizing extroverts rather than introverts? Seems to me a swap of those disadvantages isn't really the way we need to try and create a diverse and inclusive environment. And if we move to hybrid, of course, we have this problem of proximity bias. It's pretty clear by now that proximity bias is one of the main issues that we have when it comes to working in this new way. People who are more close physically with people and their bosses are more likely to get the opportunities and more likely to progress their careers. Again, you look at data from before COVID, before the shift to remote, there was increasing evidence that this is the reason how people moved up in their careers. Basically sitting next to the boss and within line of sight with the boss. If you're out of line of sight, you're out of mind. Now, what happens if you're in a mixed environment, remote and hybrid, remote and on-premise? It would be the case that the people who are remote are going to be further away from the mind of the people that control your career. So what are we going to do about all of this? There's a few things I think we need to do. Firstly, is awareness. We need to understand that the primary way in which we recruit people and make assessments, which is the case pre-COVID and is still the case now, whether it's in person or via Zoom or a video call, is the interview. The interview is something that is always going to be loaded with cognitive biases. We've simply shifted the biases in a different way now. It doesn't mean it goes away. We need to really rethink the value of the interview in our hiring process. Is there another way in which we could assess a person's functional fit to the business without having to make a decision based on sort of intangible information that we get from an interview experience? What about mitigating bias at interview? One of the really important innovations that we have is that a shift to remote is also simultaneously a digitization of previously non-digital processes. An interview in person was basically 2 or 3 people going off into a room and then those people emerging with some sort of decision. We had no idea what actually happened within that process. Suddenly, with the shift to video interviewing, we have new technology which can really help support us mitigate the bias. This new category is called interview analytics, and I've just picked out a screenshot from one of the companies that provides this type of service, where it does stuff like monitor how long an interview takes, how many questions are being asked, do the questions vary based on the identity of the person being interviewed, how many times does this person, the hiring manager, interrupt this person, and does that vary according to the identity of the person being interviewed? Suddenly we have much more information as to what goes on in an interview, and this type of data can really help us either upskill the hiring manager or the recruiter in terms of how they interview, or at least understand how these decisions are being made, and give us the opportunity to put a corrective in there. We also, I think, need to re-examine how jobs actually are. We tend to have this kind of approach where we want to universalize our assessment approach. We often actually call it a source of pride to say we interview candidates or we assess candidates in this way. However, different jobs require different assessments, particularly based on whether the jobs have a degree of collaboration intensity. For instance, if certain jobs are highly integrated and highly complex, probably an interview is an appropriate way to assess fit for the job. However, other jobs that are more modular and more simple, more likely to be able to be done in a remote way, perhaps the interview recedes as a relevant way to assess the candidate. So again, it is about rethinking about where the interview is and modulating it in terms of whether it's an important or less important part of how you assess the candidate. How about producing real-world assessments? I think we all know about the value of these. Rather than just kind of use legacy processes to try and identify whether this person is good or bad at doing the job, how about we test for the skills that they're actually doing? Some really good examples already that are happening. Toggle, I believe, is a Scandinavian company that have done this for a long time, where they have an online kind of assessment approach. That's the first thing they do when they interact with the candidate. They don't do interviews until people have actually completed a very short 10-minute test based on the job that they're going through. And it's a functional test based on the activities that they'll be performing in the job. What about enabling candidate choice of assessment? This will require a lot more work from us. We universalize because it's efficient for us, but is it right for the candidate? Sometimes the candidate needs to be able to choose how they're going to be assessed. Is it going to be a work trial? Is it going to be a whiteboard? Is it going to be an interview? Why don't we allow the candidate to make some decisions as to how they think they're going to best perform? All of these things are inadequate assessments for the real job, but for us to impose a way in which they're going to be assessed is an efficiency gain for us, but we're going to wash out candidates that could be a very good fit simply because it's not their optimal way of being assessed. Finally, what about enabling the customization of work? This should really be a, here we go, some animations here, I beg your pardon. Enabling the customization of work is a recognition that what flexible work means different things to different people. Does it mean arrival and departure times? Does it mean location independence? Does it mean control over work shifts? What about the compressing the time? Do I want to work 3 days, 40-hour week rather than 5 days, 40-hour week? Choice of control over teams, over who you interact with, your work environment, flexibility means different things. I guess the maximalist goal that we have through all of this is, can we create the kind of jobs that allow customization so that the individual coming in can design the job that actually suits their kind of needs rather than ours. This is the ultimate way to try and reduce the bias of the remote first world. So, to very quickly recap, I think I only have 1 minute. Remote definitely increases accessibility. At the same time, there are new DE&I challenges have emerged. We're probably understating and underreporting what these are. So the first thing we need to do is to raise awareness as to what these new challenges are going to be. Thirdly, we can mitigate some of these challenges with more technology, not less. There's a lot of people out there that I think have a reflexive negative attitude towards technology because they distrust it, or they distrust the application, they distrust AI, they think it needs to be a human process. But no, we have moved to a remote world. That is a digitization of how work is going to be done. We need to use the data, not be afraid of it. Thirdly, let's have a rethink of the value of these interview assessment stages, particularly the interview. Always going to be loaded with bias. We should only really value the interview if it is a commensurate with the type of work this person is going to be doing. Is the collaboration intensity high? Yes, if it is, the interview is probably the most appropriate way to assess that person. And finally, why don't we reimagine the relationship that we have with work and workers? Allow the candidate to redesign the job rather than have a situation where we have clearly defined what it is and this person must submit to doing these activities. That, I think, is fundamentally inhumane and is always going to be loaded with bias and will always inherently exclude people who would otherwise be great employees for us.
Great.
Okay, I think that's about it.
Yes, and you were pretty much on the minute. We like that a lot. You're
no
in London
worries.
today, right?
I had a stopwatch. I was literally looking at it, Charlotte.
That's a good one.
Because
I appreciate
you instructed
that.
me, hey, cut it short. So that's it. Yeah.
Keep to the time. That's important. I have a couple of questions for you. I really like the idea of candidates being able to choose their own assessment solution. It's a great candidate experience, if anything, and you will probably feel more comfortable. And like you said, you will get a better result. But how common is this? And what companies do it? Is it just a vision, or is it actually happening?
Some companies do it for specific jobs, but it is absolutely not common, and it's very much a niche idea. And there's good reasons why it is that way, because it is fundamentally inefficient. So one of the big problems we have in recruiting is that our priorities tend to be towards optimizing for efficiency.
Yes, absolutely.
This is how we produce negative candidate experience. Those two things are almost like two different weights in the scale. If we decide to go maximalist in terms of optimization, guess what? The candidate experience is going to go down. If we want to try and elevate the candidate experience, we have to trade off a little bit of optimization. So I'd love to see more companies experiment with it. I think there's lots of reasons why we should, simply because if we genuinely believe that a diverse set of people might be able to do a certain type of job, then why don't we have the assessment that's appropriate for that person, rather than thinking, you know what, this is the single way in which we're going to assess purely because it's efficient for us as a recruiter.
Correct. And that brings us a little bit to tech in general right now. There's a lot of rec tech going on out there, and I know you work quite a lot and see a lot of things around there. What do you think we're going to see in the next couple of years?
Oh, so I'm very excited by where we're at with technology, and I'm sure you are as well,
absolutely.
Charlotte. So it's a really exciting place. I do think the shift to remote basically is a digitization of all of the analog processes that we previously had in recruiting, right? So basically, before we had sort of some digitization and some analog, now it's like entirely digitized, which is great for technology application, and it should mean really interesting things. So a couple of categories I think to look out for, I think I'm really excited by. Number one, I'll refer back to interview analytics. I think that's a huge sort of a growth market. There's a lot of small companies that are starting to raise significant money into this space. The entire idea is, can we upskill the interview capability of our teams? Can we improve the interview? If we're committed to interview, let's make them better. And we can make them better basically by recording how these interviews occur and start monitoring things like who is interrupting what. What is the sentiment analysis? Can we spot how this manager is starting to ask questions to this type of candidate, but not to another type of candidate?
Correct.
Why is that? So all of these things I think are super exciting. interview analytics is one. Second one, really briefly, I think that we are way past time for sort of automated scheduling. We need to absolutely get rid of this. We need to get rid of human-based scheduling, should I say. So I'm excited to see the mass adoption, I think, of automated scheduling software. Right now, it's still a bit manual, like a Calendly type of thing, but we're starting to see AI-type solutions which can start pick out the optimal time in which people are able to interact and then just pre-book it for us. I think that will be a mandatory thing in a couple of years also. Again, the shift to remote really helps that because you get rid of the commute and you get rid of the variables of someone needing to actually arrive at a certain place. It should be much more simple to do something in this automated way. Finally, one more, if I have time, Charlotte. I would say we need to change how we feed back information to candidates. So right now we have a very linear way of like pushing information through a recruiting funnel. Every stage a candidate goes through, we collect some information, we pass it on to the next stage, and we pass it back based on how that candidate is done. All of those stages require a human being to basically carry information backwards and forwards. That's always going to lead to a problem. Any single break in the chain is going to create a poor candidate experience. There's a new way to do it. I think we need to really lean into kind of a more open source philosophy in terms of how we deal with information, expose what is going on. The interview process should be 100% transparent, and we should have a central place where a candidate can go to be able to pick up that sort of information as to where they're at in process, rather than have this linear way of doing it.
Correct. That's very good input, and I think there's a couple of solutions out on the market. I know we're very close to one of them in terms of Tengai, so I got to push that, of course, and say. But there's one more question here, and it comes from the audience. Oh, wow, here came another one. I think I'm stealing that because that's more a techie question for you. Do you think that blockchain will support candidates owning their own data in the future, and that it will move the power more to the candidates to start the interview process? Blockchain again.
Sure. So I'm a big fan of blockchain. I think it's a remarkable revolution in terms of ultimately about decentralization and getting rid of any centralized player. The big challenge we have with blockchain is basically it's inefficient from a technology point of view. That's the point. You know, it's hard to actually produce efficiently. And adoption. Adoption is the biggest problem with blockchain, and I think for that reason it's going to be a struggle. There's a lot of really interesting blockchain-like products out there. You know, there's some companies I'm really close to that I'm excited by, but I think it's one of those where they will probably have to sort of work on a certain niche before it goes to mass adoption. And there's so many vested interests that will try and prevent the mass adoption from happening. So it's going to be a long road. The answer to the question is yes, technically that's there, but practically there's going to be a lot of challenges.
And that's a good stop, because now we're definitely running out of time. So thank you very much, Hung Lee, and have a continuing nice morning or afternoon in London. And over to you, Lucas.